The conference room still smelled like the funeral flowers we'd sent back to the house just 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks after we'd buried our dad in the plot he'd picked out years before, when he still had hope the chemo would work, his lawyer announced something at the will reading that sent shivers up my spine. The kind of shivers that start at the base of your skull and work their way down, vertebra by vertebra, until your whole body goes cold. Mr. Patterson, Dad's lawyer for 23 years, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat with the solemnity of a judge about to deliver a life sentence. To Cameron, I leave $3 million, the vacation property in Aspen, and 1/3 ownership of the company. Cameron was my big brother, so this made sense. At 35, he was the oldest, the golden child who'd played college football and married into old money. He sat there in his designer suit, the one that probably cost more than my car payment, nodding as if he'd been expecting exactly this. As if he deserved exactly this. To Juliana, I leave $3 million, the downtown investment properties, and 1/3 ownership of the company. Juliana, my sister, started celebrating by jumping up and down like she'd won the lottery. Her perfectly manicured hands clapped together, her diamond bracelet, the one Dad had given her for her 30th birthday, catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. She was 33, always the dramatic one, always the one who knew how to make Dad laugh even when the medical bills were piling up on his desk. To Reed, I leave $3 million, the beach house in Florida, and 1/3 ownership of the company. Yes, whatever. Reed was 31, the smooth talker who'd somehow convinced Dad that his series of failed startups were just learning experiences. I was patiently waiting for my name, for my share of the company, especially knowing that I'd been single-handedly running it for the past 2 years. 2 years of 16-hour days, of sleeping in the office when deadlines loomed, of learning every single aspect of the construction business from the ground up because Dad was too sick to do it himself. Mr. Patterson paused, and I sat up straighter in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs with anticipation. To Thomas, I leave $1. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, suspended for just a moment before dropping. Time seemed to stop. The grandfather clock in the corner. Dad's pride and joy, the one he'd restored himself, ticked loudly in the sudden silence. Wait, what? I asked, unable to believe what I'd just heard. My voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. You get $1, the lawyer repeated, his expression carefully neutral, professionally blank, and I saw my 3 siblings starting to smirk. Cameron's was subtle, just a slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. Juliana wasn't even trying to hide hers. Reed looked away, but his shoulders were shaking with suppressed laughter. That was it? $1? After everything I'd sacrificed, every relationship I'd let wither, every opportunity I'd turned down to be there for Dad and for this company? There must be a mistake, I said, my hands gripping the armrests of the leather chair so hard my knuckles turned white. I've been running the company for 2 years. Cameron reached into his wallet with practiced ease, pulled out a crisp dollar bill like he was tipping a valet, and handed it to me. Then he said, his voice dripping with condescension, Yeah, well, Dad only trained you because we'd need someone to manage it. You can stay on as an employee if you want. We'll pay you a salary. The words hit me like a physical blow. An employee, not a partner, not family, an employee. I sat there staring at that dollar bill, feeling its weight in my trembling hand so light it was almost nothing, yet somehow crushing me with the weight of betrayal. My whole body shaking with rage that started in my gut and spread through my chest, my arms, my clenched jaw. 2 years. My health sacrificed to stress and sleepless nights, my future mortgaged to Dad's vision, my entire life poured into this company like water into sand, and they gave me $1. Cameron pocketed his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to fight for anything, and turned to me with the expression of a CEO addressing middle management. So, Tommy, we'll need you to stay on and run things. Us owners can't do the day-to-day stuff. We have other commitments, you understand. Juliana nodded enthusiastically, her pearl earrings swinging with the movement. We'll pay you a decent salary. Maybe 70 grand? That's generous for someone your age, don't you think? They were discussing my employment terms like I was a stranger interviewing for a job, like I hadn't been there at 3 a.m. when the concrete pour went wrong, Like I hadn't personally called in favors to keep suppliers on board when Dad's medical bills made our cash flow look like a bad joke. Reed snapped his fingers at me, the sound sharp and dismissive in the quiet room. Actually, before we discuss that, be a sport and grab us some coffee. We need to celebrate properly. Black for me, Juliana takes hers with cream, and Cameron likes... That's when I understood. The realization crashed over me like ice water, shocking and clarifying all at once. In their minds, I'd always been the help. The useful brother who handled the messy work, who got his hands dirty, who dealt with the foreman and the permits and the inspectors while they collected profits and prestige. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor and yelled, "I'm not your employee!" The lawyer looked uncomfortable, gathering his papers as if he wanted to disappear. Cameron sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Come on, don't be dramatic," Juliana interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "You still need a job, and we need someone to run things. It works out perfectly. It's actually a win-win situation if you think about it." I looked at each of them in turn, these strangers wearing familiar faces. Faces I'd known my entire life. Faces that looked like mine in the old family photos hanging in Mom's house, but belonging to people I didn't recognize anymore. "You have no idea what you've inherited, do you?" Dad was already struggling before he got sick. The business was hemorrhaging money. I'm the only reason this company still exists. Cameron laughed, the sound rich with dismissive confidence. "It's a construction company, not rocket science. We just need to maintain what Dad built." I walked to the door, my legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, then turned back to give them a warning they wouldn't understand until it was too late. "Your first payroll is due in 3 days. Your biggest client, Morrison Development, requires daily progress reports I've been filing personally. Your foreman, Mike, only stayed because of personal loyalty to me. He's had offers for 20% more elsewhere. You have 3 months before this all comes crashing down." Reed called out, his voice full of the bravado of the ignorant. "Don't be ridiculous. We own this company now. We'll figure it out." "Yes," I said, allowing myself the smallest smile. "Good luck with that." I walked out, knowing exactly what would happen next. I'd seen it before, in business school case studies, in competitors who'd imploded. The pattern was predictable, almost mathematical in its certainty. 3 months later, my phone rang at midnight. I was in my new apartment, the small one-bedroom I could actually afford now that I wasn't working 100-hour weeks, watching a documentary, and finally feeling like I could breathe. Cameron's name lit up on the screen, his contact photo still the one from Dad's last birthday party. I almost didn't answer, but my curiosity won. I wanted to hear it. "Tommy, we need you at the office tomorrow morning. 8 sharp, he said, like he was still my boss, like the past 3 months hadn't happened. "Excuse me?" "The foreman quit today. Took half the crew with him. You need to talk to him. Get him back." His tone was annoyed, not desperate. Not yet. He kept going when I didn't answer, his words tumbling out faster now. "Also, 3 clients are being difficult about their contracts. You need to smooth that over. And suppliers want cash up front now, which is ridiculous. They've never done that before." He was literally giving me a to-do list, like I worked for him, like I was still the little brother who jumped when he snapped his fingers. "Cameron, I don't work for you. Don't be petty, Tommy. We're offering you a position. That's more than fair for someone with no ownership stake. You should be grateful we're even considering bringing you back after you walked out." I could hear Juliana in the background, her voice shrill with stress. "Tell him it's not negotiable. Tell him he has to help us." "I don't care," I said, each word measured and deliberate. "I'm not coming back." Cameron's voice sharpened, taking on an edge of panic he was trying desperately to mask. "You have to. It's Dad's company. Don't you care about his legacy? It's your company now. You made sure of that." The irony was so bitter I could taste it. "Look," his tone shifted, trying to sound reasonable, trying to sound like the big brother who used to help me with my homework instead of the person who'd handed me a dollar bill 3 months ago. "We both know you need this job. You can't have found anything else this fast, and we need someone experienced. 100 grand. Final offer." "No. Tommy, stop being difficult." Reed grabbed the phone, his voice loud and aggressive in my ear. "Get your butt in here tomorrow or we'll sue you for sabotage. You did something to make this fail. You must have. Sue me for what? Not being your employee? I kept my voice calm, almost amused. He went silent at that, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his thick skull. Cameron grabbed the phone again, his voice finally cracking, the facade of control shattering like thin ice. Tommy, please. We can't make payroll Friday. The bank's calling in loans. They're talking about foreclosure on the office building. Now the panic was finally creeping in, real and raw and desperate. We were wrong, okay? We convinced Dad you were too young for ownership. We met with the lawyer while Dad was confused from the chemo when he didn't know what day it was half the time. So this was the real truth, finally spilling out like poison from a wound. They had manipulated the will to cut me out, had whispered in Dad's ear when he was at his weakest, not expecting it would all blow up in their faces. Not expecting that running a company actually required work, knowledge, relationships built over years. We'll lose everything if this company goes under. Our houses, everything. The bank will come after our personal assets. Juliana's voice came through, no longer commanding, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. Tommy? We're family. Please. I have kids. Reed has his mortgage. We can't lose everything. I thought about that for a moment. Thought about family, about what that word was supposed to mean, about the brother who handed me $1, about the sister who wanted me to fetch her coffee, about watching them celebrate while I held my inheritance. You haven't been my family since you asked me to fetch your coffee, I said, and hung up. But that was a mistake. Update. I sat there in my apartment staring at my phone screen for maybe 20 minutes after the call ended. My hands were still shaking, but I couldn't tell anymore if it was from anger or from something else. Something that felt worse than anger. I got up and poured myself a drink from the cheap whiskey bottle I kept in the kitchen cabinet. The kind that burns going down. I told myself I did the right thing, that they deserved what was coming to them, that this was justice, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept seeing Juliana's kids in my mind, even though I barely knew them. Kept hearing the panic in Cameron's voice when he talked about losing his house. I finished the drink and poured another one. When I finally fell asleep around 4 a.m, I dreamed about Dad and woke up feeling worse. The next morning, I opened my laptop and checked my bank account, something I'd been avoiding for weeks. The number staring back at me was bad. Really bad. I had maybe 2 months of savings left if I was careful about spending. The job market for construction managers wasn't what I'd hoped it would be. I'd sent out 17 applications over the past 3 months and gotten exactly 3 interviews. None of them went anywhere because I couldn't explain why I left my last job without sounding bitter or crazy. My resume had this giant hole where it should say I managed a family company during a crisis and kept it running. Instead, it just looked like I quit for no reason. Every recruiter asked the same question, and I never had a good answer. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall for a while. My phone buzzed with a text from Raymond, my old college roommate. He wanted to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but figured I needed to get out of the apartment before I went crazy. We met at this place downtown that made overpriced lattes. Raymond showed up in his work clothes, some tech company polo shirt and jeans. He gave me this look like he was worried about me. I told him everything. The will reading. The $1. The phone call at midnight. Cameron begging. Me hanging up. I expected him to be on my side completely, to tell me my siblings were terrible people and I did the right thing. Instead, he went quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee and not looking at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. He said my siblings sounded awful and what they did was wrong. But then he asked if I'd thought about all the workers who would lose their jobs when the company went under. The question hit me wrong. I got defensive immediately, told him they should have thought about that before cutting me out, told him it wasn't my problem anymore. He just nodded, but I could see he didn't agree with me. The question stuck with me after we left, rolling around in my head like a rock in my shoe. A week after I hung up on Cameron, I saw an article in the local business section about the company. The headline talked about suppliers filing liens and possible bankruptcy. My first reaction was this mean satisfaction, like watching karma work in real time. But then I kept reading and saw they'd quoted one of the longtime crew leaders. A guy named Martinez who'd worked for Dad for 15 years. He said he was worried about feeding his family. The article mentioned that 15 families depended on the company as their main income. Suddenly, my revenge didn't feel as clean as it had. I closed the browser and tried not to think about it. 10 days after the phone call, I got a message on LinkedIn from Greta. She was the company accountant, this older woman who'd been there since before I was born. Her message was professional, but I could feel the panic underneath. She explained that my siblings had burned through the company's cash reserves trying to cover problems they didn't understand. They'd made decisions that broke contracts with 3 big clients. Morrison was threatening to sue for breach of contract, which would destroy any chance of the company recovering. The bank was getting ready to call in all the loans because my siblings had missed 2 payments. I read the message 3 times and didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied. Another part felt sick. I didn't reply. Then the phone calls started. Former co-workers and crew members somehow got my number and started calling to ask if the rumors were true. Was the company really going under? Should they start looking for other jobs? One of them was Elizabeth. Her husband had worked on my crews for 8 years and they'd just had a baby. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. She just wanted to know if she needed to start looking at other options for her family. The worry in her voice made my stomach hurt. These people hadn't done anything wrong. They'd just shown up and done their jobs. Now they were going to pay the price for my family's mess. I told her I didn't know what was going to happen and got off the phone as fast as I could. My own money situation got worse when my landlord knocked on my door one evening. He handed me a notice that the building was going condo. I had 60 days to either buy my unit for $320,000 or move out. I didn't have anywhere close to enough for a down payment. Finding a new apartment in this market with my savings running out felt impossible. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to be homeless while my siblings each had $3 million in properties in Aspen and Florida. I was the one who actually earned it, and I was the one who'd end up on the street. 3 weeks after I hung up, someone knocked on my apartment door at 9 at night. I opened it and barely recognized Juliana. She looked nothing like the put-together person from the will reading. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled like she'd been wearing them for days. She'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy. She stood there in my doorway and started talking fast. Reed's wife had left him because their assets were about to be taken by the bank. Cameron's in-laws were threatening to cut them off completely because he'd destroyed his reputation in the business world. She didn't ask me to come back. She just stood there crying and telling me how bad everything had gotten. I let her talk for a few minutes and then closed the door. I felt awful, but I didn't know what else to do. Against my better judgment, I started digging into what actually happened during Dad's last months. I called his hospice nurses and got copies of medical records I could access. What I found made me feel worse instead of better. Dad had been on heavy pain medication that messed with his thinking for the last 6 weeks. There were notes in his chart about family meetings with the lawyer that happened during his worst times when the nurses had written that he was confused and didn't know what day it was. The manipulation was even more planned out than I'd thought, but it also meant Dad might not have really understood what he was signing. I found a box in my closet that the hospice had sent me months ago. I'd been too angry to open it. Inside were Dad's personal things: his watch, his wallet, his phone. I turned on the phone and found voice recordings he'd made during his treatment. I sat on my apartment floor and listened to them. In several recordings from before the heavy drugs started, he talked about making sure Tommy got his fair share, about protecting the one who actually knew the business. His voice was clear and strong in those early recordings. His intentions were obvious before my siblings got to him. It made the betrayal feel even worse, but it also mixed my anger up with grief in a way I hadn't expected. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Juliana asking if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. I almost deleted it, but something about the message felt different. No demands, no attitude, just a simple request. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop halfway between our places, the kind of generic chain where nobody would recognize us. She walked in 20 minutes late and I barely recognized her. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a plain sweater that looked like she'd owned them for years. Her face was bare of makeup, showing dark circles under her eyes that makeup used to hide. She'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy, her cheeks hollow and her collarbones sharp under her shirt. She sat down across from me without ordering anything, probably because she couldn't afford the $5 coffee. Her hands shook as she put her phone on the table between us. She started talking fast, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in for weeks. Her kids kept asking why they couldn't go back to their private school, why they had to switch to public school in the middle of the year. She'd told them it was temporary, but they were smart enough to know something was wrong. Last week, her daughter asked if they were poor now. Juliana opened her purse and showed me an empty jewelry box, the velvet interior still shaped to hold the pieces that used to be there. She'd sold everything, even the diamond bracelet Dad gave her for her 30th birthday, just to make her mortgage payment last month. Her voice cracked when she admitted what they'd done. She and Cameron and Reed had met with Mr. Patterson while Dad was on the heavy pain medication, the kind that made him confused about what day it was. They'd convinced him I was too young for equal ownership, that I needed more time to prove myself, that they would protect the company better. She said they were jealous because Dad talked about me constantly during those last months, about how proud he was that I'd learned the business so well. They wanted to prove they deserved their inheritance, wanted to show they were just as capable. She looked at me with red eyes and said they'd destroyed everything out of jealousy and stupidity. I sat there listening to her confession and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just this empty space where my feelings used to be. I finished my coffee and left without promising her anything. 3 days after that, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Stanley, one of Dad's oldest clients, someone who'd been working with the company since before I was born. He asked if I could meet him at a construction site where we'd done work about 2 years ago, said there was something I needed to see. I drove out there during my lunch break from the terrible new job I'd just started. Stanley was waiting in the parking lot, wearing his usual work boots and company jacket. He walked me through the site, pointing at things that made my stomach turn. The crew my siblings had hired to replace the team that quit had done work that wasn't just bad. It was dangerous. Railings that wobbled when you touched them, concrete that had been poured wrong and was already showing cracks, electrical boxes installed in places that violated basic safety codes. Stanley stopped at a section of scaffolding and showed me where it was attached to the building with the wrong hardware. He said someone was going to get hurt, maybe killed, if this wasn't fixed soon. He wasn't asking me to fix it. He made that clear. But he wanted me to know that Dad's reputation for quality and safety was destroyed with every job the new crew touched. People in the industry were starting to talk, starting to associate the family name with shoddy work and cut corners. He'd heard other contractors joking about it at a trade meeting last week. I looked at the company sign near the entrance, Dad's name still on it in the logo he'd designed himself, and felt sick. I thanked Stanley for showing me and drove back to my new job without promising anything. The networking event that week was supposed to help me find better opportunities, but instead, it made everything worse. I showed up at the construction industry mixer at a hotel downtown, wearing the one good suit I still owned. I spotted people I'd worked with for years, suppliers and contractors and project managers who used to call me directly with questions. They saw me coming and suddenly found reasons to look at their phones or refill their drinks. The ones who did talk to me kept the conversation short, their eyes moving past me like they were looking for someone more important. I overheard 2 guys I used to have lunch with talking near the bar. One of them said something about the guy who abandoned his family company right when his siblings needed him most. The other one laughed and said something about entitled kids who don't appreciate what they inherit. They didn't see me standing 10 feet away. I tried to explain the situation to a project manager I'd known for 5 years, told him about the will and the $1 and being asked to fetch coffee. But as the words came out, I realized how it sounded. Like I was bitter. Like I was making excuses. Like I was the problem. He nodded politely and said he had to make a call. I left early and checked my email in the parking lot. 3 more job applications had been rejected that day. The rejection emails all said basically the same thing, that they'd decided to go with candidates who better fit their needs. I was starting to realize that my professional reputation was damaged by a narrative I couldn't correct without sounding petty or defensive. My bank account hit the number I'd been dreading 2 weeks later. After paying rent and utilities, I had maybe $600 left. Not enough for another month. Not enough for health insurance. Not enough for anything except the cheapest food and hoping nothing unexpected happened. I'd applied to 43 jobs in the construction industry and gotten exactly 7 interviews. None of them went anywhere because I couldn't explain the gap in my resume without the whole story coming out. I finally took a job with a small residential contractor doing project management for $45,000 a year. It was less than half what I'd been making, less than what I'd earned as an entry-level project coordinator 5 years ago. My new boss was a guy named Derek who treated me like I'd never seen a construction site before. He explained basic concepts I'd been using for years, talked to me like I was fresh out of college, gave me tasks that an intern could handle. On my third day, he had me organizing the supply closet and updating the equipment inventory spreadsheet. I came home to my cheap apartment that night and ate ramen for dinner because it was all I could afford until my first paycheck came. I sat on my couch that sagged in the middle and wondered if my pride was worth being broke and starting over at 29. Raymond called me the next week and said Cassandra wanted to help. His wife worked in business consulting and she'd offered to review the company's situation as a favor. I met them at their house on a Saturday morning. Cassandra had spreadsheets printed out, financial reports she'd somehow gotten access to, notes from conversations she'd had with people in the industry. She walked me through everything my siblings had done wrong over the past 4 months. Cameron had been making decisions based on ego rather than business sense, taking on projects that looked impressive but lost money, turning down steady work because it seemed beneath him. Reed had been trying to implement startup ideas in a traditional construction business, talking about disruption and innovation, when what the company needed was basic operational competence. Juliana had been spending company money on marketing that was really just vanity projects, hiring expensive consultants to redesign the logo and create promotional videos instead of focusing on the actual work. Cassandra explained that each of them had different ways of destroying things, but they all came from the same place. They were insecure about inheriting something they hadn't earned, desperate to prove they deserved it, trying to make their mark instead of just keeping things running. She showed me emails where Cameron had ignored advice from experienced crew leaders, where Reed had pitched ideas that made no sense for the industry, where Juliana had approved spending that had nothing to do with actual business needs. I took notes but didn't commit to anything. I thanked her for the analysis and left. Miguel from the bank called me 3 days later from a number I didn't recognize. He said this was off the record, that he could get in trouble for contacting me directly, but he'd known our family for 20 years and thought I should know what was coming. The company had 10 days before the bank started foreclosure proceedings on everything. Once that happened, it was over. No chance of recovery, no way to restructure, no possibility of saving anything. The employees would all lose their jobs. The family name would be associated with bankruptcy in every industry database. My siblings would lose their personal assets because they'd personally guaranteed the business loans, something they apparently didn't understand when they signed the papers. Miguel said he'd seen too many family businesses destroy themselves over pride and stubbornness, and he was telling me this because there was still a small window to fix things. After the foreclosure started, the legal process became automatic and irreversible. He said this was the last chance before everything became permanent. I thanked him for the warning but didn't promise anything. I spent that afternoon trying to help without actually returning to the company. I found the contact information for a turnaround consultant I'd known from business school, someone who specialized in saving failing businesses. I sent him an email introducing him to my siblings, explaining the situation in general terms, suggesting he might be able to help. He called me back 2 days later after meeting with Cameron, Reed, and Juliana. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He said they were too far gone for an outside expert to fix. The problems weren't just financial or operational, they were relational. The clients didn't trust the new management. The suppliers had stopped extending credit. The crew members who stayed were the ones who couldn't find other jobs, not the good ones. He needed someone who knew the specific relationships, who had personal connections with the clients and suppliers and workers. He needed someone who could make calls and have people actually answer. He needed me. An outside consultant could give advice, but they couldn't rebuild trust that had taken years to develop. I realized my plan to help without returning wasn't going to work. The consultant called again a week later with an update that made everything worse. Cameron had refused to implement any of the recommended changes because doing so would require him to admit he'd been making terrible decisions. He'd gotten defensive in their meeting, argued with every suggestion, insisted that the problems were temporary and would resolve themselves. Within 3 days of that meeting, Morrison pulled their contract entirely. The $1.2 million in annual revenue they represented was just gone. Two other major clients followed within 48 hours, both of them citing quality concerns and missed deadlines. The consultant sent me a final email saying there was nothing more he could do. He said he'd been doing this work for 15 years and had never seen someone so committed to self-destruction. My siblings wouldn't listen to anyone, wouldn't accept that they needed to change, wouldn't admit they were wrong. He wished me luck and closed his file on the case. I saw the local business news article about Morrison pulling out that same afternoon. The headline talked about the company's decline and mentioned my father's name. The comments section had people talking about how sad it was to see a good company destroyed by the next generation. Mr. Patterson sent me an email 2 days after that, asking if we could meet at his office. I went after work, still wearing the cheap work clothes from my terrible new job. He had files spread across his desk, documents I'd never seen before. He said he should have shared this information months ago, but he'd been worried about legal complications. He'd advised Dad against the will changes and had documented his concerns in writing. He had notes from meetings where he'd specifically stated that Dad seemed confused and might not fully understand what he was signing. He'd recorded conversations where Dad talked about his original intentions to give me equal ownership. He showed me emails he'd sent to my siblings warning them that manipulating someone on heavy medication could invalidate the will. They'd threatened to take their business to another lawyer if he didn't do what they wanted. Mr. Patterson pulled out a folder with recordings of Dad from before the heavy medications started, conversations where Dad talked clearly about making sure I got my fair share and protecting the one who actually knew the business. He said he had enough documentation to contest the will in court, that he would testify about Dad's mental state during those final meetings, that he believed a judge would rule in my favor. He offered to help me pursue that path if I wanted. I took copies of everything, but told him I needed time to think. I spent the entire weekend in my apartment thinking about what I actually wanted. Not what was fair, not what I deserved, not what would feel like justice, but what outcome would actually make my life better. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. I didn't want to spend the next 2 or 3 years in court fighting over the will, dealing with lawyers and depositions and appeals. I didn't want to watch 15 families lose their jobs because my siblings couldn't run a company. I didn't want Dad's life work to end in bankruptcy and public shame. I didn't want the family name to become a joke in the industry. But I also didn't want to be taken advantage of again. I didn't want to work for my siblings or be treated like an employee in a company I'd built. I didn't want to sacrifice everything just to save them from their own mistakes. Any solution had to involve real respect and fair compensation, not just me swooping in to fix their mess while they kept all the ownership and control. I looked at my bank account again. I looked at job listings that all paid less than I was worth. I looked at the documentation Mr. Patterson had given me. I thought about what kind of life I wanted to have in 5 years. In 10 years. I thought about whether my pride was worth watching everything collapse. By Sunday night, I still didn't have answers, but I was starting to understand the questions better. Monday morning, I called Cassandra and asked if she could help me draft something formal. She came over that afternoon with her laptop, and we sat at my kitchen table working through the details. I told her what I wanted, and she helped me put it into proper legal language without making it sound threatening. The proposal was simple in concept, but detailed in execution. 1/3 ownership of the company, exactly equal to what each of my siblings held. Full operational control with no interference from the other owners. A salary of $150,000, which below market rate for what I'd be doing but fair given the company's current situation. The proposal included clawback provisions that would reduce my siblings' ownership percentages by 5% each if they tried to interfere with operations or override my decisions. It required them to stay completely out of business decisions while keeping their financial stake and dividend rights. Cassandra helped me add provisions that protected me from being outvoted or forced out, and we included a requirement for unanimous consent on any major business decisions like selling the company or taking on debt over a certain threshold. We worked on it for 3 hours, going through multiple drafts until every word was exactly right. When we finished, I read through it one more time and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but clarity. I knew what I wanted, and I'd put it in writing. I sent the proposal to all 3 siblings at 6 p.m. on Monday evening with a simple cover email. No explanations, no justifications, just the document attached and a single line stating that my offer expired in 48 hours. and I wouldn't negotiate after that deadline. I hit send and closed my laptop. My phone rang 18 minutes later. Cameron's name lit up the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice came through angry and loud, accusing me of taking advantage of their crisis and trying to steal what Dad had left them. He said the company was still legally theirs, and I had no right to make demands like I was doing. He went through the proposal point by point, arguing against each term, insisting that they'd already offered me fair compensation, and I was being unreasonable. He said they could hire a professional manager, someone with credentials and experience, someone who wouldn't try to extort ownership from the rightful heirs. His voice got louder as he talked, the panic underneath his anger becoming more obvious with every sentence. I stayed calm and let him finish his whole speech without interrupting. When he finally stopped talking, I said that hiring another manager was absolutely his choice to make. I told him my offer expired in 48 hours and I wouldn't negotiate or discuss changes to the terms. He started to argue again, but I ended the call. Juliana called 2 hours later with a different approach. Her voice was softer, more reasonable, trying to find middle ground. She said they understood I deserved fair compensation, and they were willing to offer me $200,000 a year plus profit sharing. She explained that this would actually give me more money than the ownership stake I was demanding, and it would avoid all the complicated legal issues of changing the ownership structure. She talked about how we were family, and we should be able to work something out that made everyone happy. I let her make her pitch, and then told her I wasn't interested in being their employee, no matter how much they paid me. I explained again that I wanted to be an equal partner with real authority, not a subordinate who could be fired or overruled whenever they felt like it. She tried to negotiate further, but I repeated that my offer expired in 48 hours and hung up. Reed called the next morning, and his approach was different from both of them. He tried to sound like he was on my side, like he understood where I was coming from, like he wanted to help me get what I deserved. He suggested making me a junior partner with 15% ownership, which he said was generous considering I'd walked out and left them to deal with everything. He talked about compromise and being reasonable, about how rigid positions never led to good outcomes. He said 15% was real ownership, real stake in the company, and combined with a good salary, it would make me one of the highest paid construction managers in the state. I rejected his offer just like I'd rejected Juliana's. I told him the same thing I'd told both of them. Either they accepted that I was an equal partner with real authority, or they figured it out themselves. He got defensive and said I was being stubborn and short-sighted, that I was going to regret letting my pride destroy this opportunity. I ended the call and went back to my terrible job at the residential contractor, spending the day doing tasks that someone fresh out of college could handle. The deadline was approaching, and I'd heard nothing more from any of them. Part of me expected them to call back with another counteroffer, but my phone stayed quiet. I got home from work on Wednesday evening, 6 hours before my deadline expired, and checked my email. There was a message from Miguel at the bank marked urgent. He'd sent it to all 4 of us. The bank had officially begun foreclosure proceedings on the company properties due to missed payments and breach of loan covenants. They were exercising their right to seize assets, and they'd be taking possession of the office building, the equipment yard, and all company vehicles within 30 days, unless the outstanding balance was paid in full. I opened another email, this one from a law firm I didn't recognize. Morrison had filed a lawsuit for breach of contract seeking damages of $1.8 million plus legal fees. They were claiming that the company's failure to meet deadlines and quality standards had caused significant financial harm to their development projects. The lawsuit named the company and all 3 owners personally. My phone buzzed with a text from Juliana, and all it said was that their lawyers had told them they were about to lose everything, including their personal assets, because they'd personally guaranteed the business loans. She said Cameron's father-in-law had called him an hour ago and told him he was cutting them off entirely, that he wouldn't help them anymore because Cameron had proven he couldn't be trusted with responsibility. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She just sent me the information like she needed me to know how bad it had gotten. I sat in my apartment reading these messages and understood that the choice my siblings faced wasn't the one they'd been pretending it was. It wasn't between keeping control or sharing it with me. It wasn't between being generous or being fair. It was between sharing control with me or losing absolutely everything they had. I made dinner and ate it slowly, watching the clock move toward 11 p.m. when my deadline would expire. At 10:45, someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw all three of them standing there together. Cameron in wrinkled clothes that looked like he'd been wearing them for days. Juliana without makeup, her face tired and older than I'd ever seen it. Reed with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. I opened the door and they came in without any of the attitude or posturing from the will reading. They sat on my couch and Cameron pulled out a printed copy of my proposal. He'd signed it. So had Juliana and Reed. They didn't argue or negotiate or try to change the terms. They just handed me the signed document and asked where they needed to sign the formal agreement. I'd called Cassandra before they arrived because I'd suspected this might happen. She showed up 20 minutes later with the proper legal documents, the ones that would actually make the ownership transfer official and binding. We sat at my kitchen table and went through every page, every clause, every provision. Cassandra explained what each section meant and made sure everyone understood what they were agreeing to. The agreement gave me 1/3 ownership, exactly equal to each of theirs. It gave me full operational control with the authority to make all business decisions without their approval. It set my salary at $150,000 annually with standard benefits. It included the clawback provisions that would reduce their ownership if they interfered with operations. It protected me from being outvoted or forced out through various legal mechanisms Cassandra had built in. It required unanimous consent for major decisions like selling the company, taking on significant debt, or changing the ownership structure. We signed everything at 1:30 in the morning. Cassandra witnessed and notarized the signatures. My siblings left without saying much beyond agreeing to meet at the office on Monday morning. I returned to the company office on Monday at 7 a.m., an hour before the official start time. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars belonging to the early crew. I walked through the front door, and the receptionist looked up from her computer. Her eyes got wide and then filled with tears. She didn't say anything, just nodded at me with this expression of relief so strong it made my chest tight. I went to my old office and found it exactly as I'd left it 4 months ago. Someone had been keeping it clean, dusting the desk and watering the plant on the windowsill. I sat down in my chair and started going through the files on the computer, looking at what had happened in my absence. Within an hour, my phone rang. Mike's name showed on the screen. I answered, and he said he'd heard I was back. He asked if it was true, if I was really in charge again, and when I confirmed it, he said he was coming back and bringing most of the crew with him. He said he'd call them all personally and have them on site by the end of the week. I spent that first day just making lists. Everything that needed immediate attention, everything that had been damaged or destroyed, every relationship that needed rebuilding. It was worse than I'd thought. The financial records showed decisions that made no sense, contracts that had been handled wrong, payments that had been missed or made to the wrong vendors. But it wasn't unfixable. It was just going to take time and work. The first 2 weeks back were worse than anything I'd experienced before. I was working 16-hour days again, sometimes 18, coming in before dawn and leaving after dark. I personally called every major client we had and explained the transition. I didn't make excuses or blame my siblings. I just told them there had been management issues that were now resolved, and I was back in full operational control. Some of them were skeptical. Some of them were angry about the problems they'd experienced, but most of them were willing to give us another chance because they'd worked with me before and trusted that I could fix things. Morrison was the hardest call. Their project manager listened to my explanation and said they'd already filed the lawsuit and weren't interested in continuing the relationship. I asked for one meeting, just 30 minutes to present a recovery plan. He agreed reluctantly. I spent 2 days preparing a detailed proposal showing exactly how we'd get their projects back on track, complete with timelines, quality assurance measures, and penalty clauses if we failed to meet the commitments. They agreed to a probationary reinstatement of the contract with strict oversight and monthly reviews. One mistake, and we were done. I called Miguel at the bank next and laid out a 90-day cash flow projection showing how we'd catch up on the missed payments. I explained the ownership change and showed him the signed agreements proving I had full operational control. He said he'd recommend pausing the foreclosure for 90 days while we demonstrated improved performance, but the clock was ticking and there was no room for error. I negotiated with suppliers who'd stopped extending credit, convincing some of them to give us net 30 terms again by personally guaranteeing payment. My siblings stayed completely out of my way during those 2 weeks. They didn't come to the office, they didn't call asking questions, they did exactly what the agreement required, which was nothing. 1 month after I returned, I was meeting with a client at a job site on the north side of town. We were walking through the construction area discussing timeline adjustments when I saw Cameron's car pull into the lot. He got out and walked over to us. I tensed up, expecting him to try to take over the meeting or undermine me somehow. Instead, he waited until the client and I finished our conversation. After the client left, Cameron asked if there was anything he could do to help. The question surprised me enough that I didn't answer right away. He said he knew he didn't understand the business like I did, but he wanted to contribute something if there was a way he could be useful. I thought about it and gave him a simple task. I asked him to review and approve the vendor invoices that came in each week, checking them against our purchase orders to make sure we weren't being overcharged or billed for things we didn't order. It was basic work, something that required attention to detail, but not construction expertise. He said he'd do it and left. The next week I checked the invoices he'd reviewed, and he'd done it correctly. He'd caught 2 billing errors I might have missed. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning, but it was the first time he'd ever acknowledged that I knew more than he did about something. The first sign that he might actually respect the boundaries we'd set and the authority I held. By the end of the 3rd month, the company had stabilized. We were making payroll consistently without scrambling for cash. Clients were renewing their contracts and some were even giving us new projects. The bank had agreed to restructure the loans on better terms now that we'd demonstrated 3 months of improved cash flow and on-time payments. We weren't back to where we were before Dad got sick. We probably never would be. The company had lost some of its best people during those months of chaos, and some clients had moved on to competitors they trusted more. But we were profitable and sustainable, which was more than I'd hoped for when I first came back. The company culture had changed, though. There was less of the family atmosphere Dad had built, the casual environment where everyone knew each other's kids' names and people hung around after work to talk. Now it felt more professional, more distant. People did their jobs well, but there was a wariness that came from everyone knowing how close we'd come to collapse. They'd seen what happened when the wrong people were in charge, and they weren't going to forget it. My relationship with my siblings settled into something that worked even though it wasn't warm. We had monthly ownership meetings where I presented financial reports and operational updates. They asked questions about the numbers and the business direction, but they didn't challenge my decisions anymore. They'd learned that lesson the hard way. Juliana's kids were back in private school because the company was paying dividends again, small ones but consistent. She sent me a thank you text after the first dividend check arrived, but we didn't talk beyond that. Reed had started a new venture with his own money, some kind of app development project that he was funding himself this time instead of asking others to invest. Cameron had backed off entirely after his marriage survived the financial crisis. His wife had apparently given him an ultimatum, and he'd chosen to focus on his family instead of trying to prove himself in business. We weren't close. We didn't have dinners together or call each other just to talk. But we were functional, and that was more than I'd expected. The agreements we'd signed created clear boundaries that everyone understood and followed. They got their dividend checks, and I ran the company. It wasn't the family Dad had hoped we'd be, but it was stable, and it worked. Sometimes late at night, I pull up Dad's old voice recordings on my phone and listen to him talk about building something that lasts. His voice sounds strong in those early recordings, before the heavy medication started, and he talks about creating a company that would take care of people for generations. The company survived all the chaos from the past year, but it's different now in ways he probably wouldn't recognize. The crews show up and do their work professionally, but nobody hangs around after hours anymore telling stories and drinking beer like they used to when Dad ran things. Everything operates on contracts and clear boundaries instead of handshakes and trust, which works better for business but feels colder somehow. I learned that you can't make family value you just because you want them to, but you can demand respect through actions and results. The best solution wasn't everyone becoming close again or pretending the betrayal never happened. It was setting clear terms that everyone understands and follows without confusion. 6 months after I came back to fix everything, I'm sitting in my new apartment reviewing the quarterly reports on my laptop. This place cost twice what my old apartment did, with actual space and windows that let in real sunlight, and I can afford it now because the company pays me what I'm actually worth. The numbers on the screen show solid growth across all our projects, with profit margins better than they've been in 3 years. My siblings each got their dividend checks this month, and nobody called me to complain or ask questions, which means they're finally learning to stay out of operations like the agreement requires. The employees all got raises last week, real ones that reflect the company's improved financial position, and I got thank you messages from people who'd been wondering if their jobs were secure. My phone buzzes with a call from a number I don't recognize, and when I answer, it's a project manager from a major development company asking if we'd be interested in bidding on a significant commercial project downtown. The company is going to be fine because we have steady clients and good people doing quality work. I'm going to be fine because I built something sustainable on my own terms, with boundaries that protect me and compensation that reflects my value. My family will never be what it was before Dad died. Probably never be what it was even before he got sick. But I've created something that works and pays the bills and lets me sleep at night. I'm proud of what I accomplished, even though getting here was messier and more complicated than I ever imagined it would be back when I walked out of that will reading holding a $1 bill.